Hey, it's Wednesday, March 18th, and today we're going to be learning a little bit about World War II in the Pacific. Hey everyone, so today we're talking about World War II, the Pacific. I'm going to walk you through these notes. This is number 49 in your notes. I know we're doing it a little bit out of order, but that's okay. So, here we go. What caused World War II? We've already talked about this, but the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I really harshly punished Germany, and so Germany had to print tons and tons of money, and with mo money comes mo problems. So they had huge financial issues, which created a system that was ripe to be taken advantage of by Adolf Hitler. So fascists like Hitler and Benito Mussolini rose to power in Germany and Italy. They basically instituted these governments that were designed to rebuild countries that were devastated. Japan's desire to create an empire throughout the Pacific was a huge deal. They started to take over huge chunks of land, and so suddenly you had all these islands throughout the Pacific being conquered by the Japanese, and we'll look at that a little bit today. And then the Great Depression, which affected the entire planet. Some nations felt the best solution was expansion, right? So Japan didn't really suffer a whole lot during the Great Depression because they were taking over more territory, getting more raw materials, more markets to sell their stuff, and so they started to do better and better and better. And the same thing happened in the 1930s when Hitler took over Germany. As they start to expand their power and as he starts to break the rules of the Treaty of Versailles, they start to become a stronger country. If we go and look at the road to war in Japan, it's pretty interesting. So from 1931 to 1941, for those 10 years, Japan is sort of getting itself going. Japan became an aggressive, expansion-focused nation during the 1930s. They lacked a lot of natural resources, most importantly oil. If you're going to have tanks or planes or any sort of modern machinery and weapons and vehicles, you're going to need oil. In 1931, they began their invasion of Manchuria, which is the northeastern part of China. They start to slowly take over this area, and no one really stands up to them. The Chinese are in the middle of a civil war between the communists and the nationalists, so they eventually put that on pause to fight against the Japanese. But China, because of this internal conflict, is having lots of problems. In 1940, Japan becomes allies with Germany and Italy. They eventually create a team, or an alliance, known as the Axis. That's AXIS. It's right there. Yep. Definitely want to write that down. In 1941, Japan invaded smaller countries in Southeast Asia. In response to Japan becoming more and more aggressive, the United States responds with something called an oil embargo. So they say, we're not going to trade any of our oil that we get from Texas or Oklahoma or wherever. We're not going to trade it with you guys because we don't really like what you're doing to these other countries, particularly French Indochina, which is this area that's like Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. And so it's controlled by the French, who is one of our allies, and you're attacking their land, so we're not going to trade oil with you. What that does is it cuts off 80% of the oil that Japan needed. So, in response, on December 7th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the Japanese decide to attack the United States. If you look here, this is Tojo, Hideki Tojo. He was the prime minister of Japan. There it is. You can see it now. So oftentimes when you see political cartoons or references to the Japanese leadership, Tojo gets a lot of the credit. The other guy is Emperor Hirohito, who's right there. He was sort of the one who put Tojo in power. And so with those two, they were the ones responsible for the Japanese expansion. If we go look at how the war is affecting America, it's pretty interesting. So, the United States gets attacked. Pearl Harbor's attacked. The USS Arizona, this is a famous shot of the USS Arizona sinking into the water at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And so it's a really horrible situation where around 3,000 Americans were killed. A lot of the sailors and U.S. naval personnel that were on board didn't have time to make it out, as they were attacked at like 7 in the morning on a Sunday. And so it's really just a tragic situation. 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers were destroyed. 200 planes were annihilated or heavily damaged during the attack, and somewhere between 2,400 and 3,000 Americans died from explosions, drowning, and fires. The next day, on December 8th, 1941, the United States declares war against the Empire of Japan. And I'll try to cut and show you that video real quick.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
So, December 8th, they declare war against Japan, and eventually they're going to declare war against Nazi Germany as well. So the United States is now going to be pulled into the war, and they have to decide, are we going to go fight against the Nazis first, or are we going to fight against the Japanese first? If you try to take them on at the same time, it's going to be a lot harder, so they really needed to focus. What you also have here is actually the last time the United States declared war. The only part of the United States that can declare war is Congress, and so Congress voted to go to war against Nazi Germany and to go to war against Imperial Japan. All the other wars since, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, all those wars, even the Cold War, they were not actually official wars. Congress might have given the president power to send American troops places, so they're de facto wars. So basically, it is a war without there actually being a declaration of war, which is kind of strange. If you look right here, you can also see the New York Times from the day that the attack took place. You can see that it's Monday, December 8th. That's when this newspaper was published. And it says, Japan wars on the United States and Britain, makes sudden attack on Hawaii, heavy fighting reported at sea. So really, it was a sort of shock that the Japanese had gone and attacked us. There's a good video that you can watch if you get around to it. Pearl Harbor, Day of Infamy. It's on YouTube, and you can also find it in these notes. If we look at how America responds and mobilizes for the war, you can see that we basically shut everything down and went into manufacturing mode. Like we said, okay, let's stop making toasters and let's start making tanks, you know. And so every sort of factory in the United States stopped producing consumer goods and started producing things that would support the war effort. In the interest of efficiency and maximum production, the majority of U.S. weapons contracts went out to major corporations. By 1945, the United States had turned out 68,000 tanks, almost 300,000 airplanes, 64,000 landing craft, 6,500 ships, and 15 million rifles and machine guns. So this is really, really impressive. These numbers are just showing America's strength, and we're sending these weapons not only to our own troops, but to the British and the French, and a lot of the weapons are going over to the Soviet Union because they're really sort of lacking those resources. And a soldier running into battle without weapons is probably not going to do so great. Women and minorities in the workplace. Women were given new opportunities to work in factories, as men who traditionally worked in these positions were called to war. Women in particular saw a huge improvement in the workforce. Women made up 24% of the workforce, and at the beginning of the war, 36% by 1945. So there's a 12% bump during the war for women working. African Americans were given opportunities but were still racially segregated, despite the fact that 700,000 African Americans served in the armed forces. One piece of propaganda that's super famous is Rosie the Riveter. You've probably seen that before. She's rolling up her sleeves and saying, "We can do it." It's sort of used as like a feminist icon. Well, the actual original Rosie the Riveter is right here. It's a painting by Norman Rockwell. And so you can see Rosie is really strong. She's kind of dirty. She's got her big rivet gun with her name on it. Or actually, her lunchbox has her name on it. And she's got some pins across her chest for victory, for first aid, those kinds of things. And if you look at the bottom there, you can see she's stepping on a book there, using it as a footstool. And it's Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. And so this is basically showing that women, by working in factories and working at home, can really help with the war effort. The war at home. Life in the United States became completely dedicated to the war effort. Japanese Americans were seen as dangerous by many Americans, and the federal government released an order that said Japanese Americans or people with Japanese American ancestry living on the West Coast had to evacuate. The government feared that Japanese Americans loyal to Japan possibly might be a threat to the United States should an invasion try to take place. So all Japanese were forced into internment camps in order to be separated from the regular population. You can see here, this is what an internment camp looks like. There is basically barbed wire surrounding these camps, and these people were forced to live in these barracks, like these big long cabins kind of that were created out in the middle of the desert to house these Japanese Americans. So they had to live there for a really long time. There is another photograph right there that shows the order that forced Japanese Americans to go into these internment camps. And a lot of the areas that were left behind were sort of taken over. Japanese internment camps that existed in America were essentially places where Japanese Americans were trapped, and they were left there for years to create their own governments and their own healthcare system and their own way of educating and feeding their children. They were just trapped, basically quarantined from the rest of the country. And so what you have is a really sad story for a lot of Japanese Americans who, when they came back, their homes were sold and somebody else was living there. Their businesses were destroyed and something else had replaced it. And so it was a really tragic situation. There's a song that I'm going to link in the Google Classroom that's right underneath this set of notes, and it's by Kenji, Kenji. That's the name of the song. It's by Fort Minor, who was one of the rappers that was in Linkin Park. And so when you listen to this song, it talks about the story of a hypothetical guy who is taken from his life in California, and he's forced to go live in a Japanese internment camp, and it's really, really interesting. And so the last thing I want you to do today is just take a listen to that. And then tomorrow we're going to go ahead and we're going to be focusing on the actual battles of World War II, like in the Pacific. So Iwo Jima and Midway and all that kind of stuff. So I hope everyone is doing well, and cool. Hope you had a great St. Patrick's Day. See you all tomorrow.